When nations are confronted with fear or oppression, many people resort to violence, feeling as if it's justified. It's important to study nonviolent events so we can compare it to the violent situations in order to find the effective route to change. We want to study nonviolence so we can observe the conditions and the stepping stones that led to the nonviolence, as well as the results of the matter. If the results were favorable, we want to learn how to simulate that in similar situations. The Indian independence movement from 1857 to 1947 is an example of a long-term, nonviolent historical event. The history of India and their road to independence began with British dominance. Britain controlled the economy as well as the cultural life in India, attempting to spread westernization throughout India. India wanted to rebel against the concepts set forth by the British, so they revolted with the Sepoy Mutiny mission. Their attacks failed, but it was not over. The disorganization of the British government led to the British controlling India's produce, such as sugarcane, coffee, silks, rice, and cereal. By 1919, most of India took the stance of active nonviolence by fasting and marching. The police eventually opened fire on one of the marches. This is what sparked Gandhi's interest, and he became the leader of the movement. These failed attempts led to the Salt March in the 1930s. One act of oppression implemented by the British was prohibiting Indians from collecting or selling salt. This impacts Indians because salt is used constantly in the Indian diet, and the salt tax was unaffordable. Gandhi and his followers walked many miles from Ahmedabad to the Arabian Sea in order to make salt from salt water. This was a protest practicing civil disobedience because they were nonviolently breaking the law in mass numbers. Even though they were not granted independence right away, this movement led to an international discussion about British policy in India. After the Salt March, there was a conference in London where Gandhi went representing India. The goal was to grant Indian independence, but this was not approved. Although Gandhi did not get what he came for, the British were willing to negotiate, which eventually led to Indian independence. The combination of long-term fear, oppression, and restraint from India had a lasting impression on everyone who was affected by it. Their first rebellion of violence seemed to set them back even further, adding to the feelings that they had held before the rebellion. India first reacted with violent campaigns, but this did not ruin the success of nonviolence. Nonviolent campaigns may be just as likely to emerge from failed violent campaigns, and successful in doing so. Nonviolent resistance exists to create positive social change through protest, satyagraha, civil disobedience, or even humor, according to research by Madge Kinjal Sorsen. Civil disobedience is a nonviolent way of refusing to obey unjust laws in order to draw attention to it. And this is exactly what the last two attempts at freedom was based around for India. This method of nonviolent resistance comes with sacrifice from everyone who participates. Barbara Deming also expresses the importance of voluntary suffering. She does not believe that religion is needed for successful nonviolence. Nonviolent resistance is not effective if the individuals involved are not prepared for the outcomes. Many people in India were arrested, knowing this was a possibility, and this mindset can lead to transformation within oneself. This individual transformation is also rooted in the belief of satyagrahas. Gandhi's satyagrahas method radiated throughout India. Its purpose is to destroy antagonisms without the harm of any individual. It also provided a healthy alternate to confrontation, intimidation, or competitiveness. Not only does it not intend to harm the opposing force, but it was to purify it through body and spirit, and leave it better than it was. The Indians never acted to harm or destroy the British, rather their goal was to make peace with themselves and with the British, ultimately purifying each other. Martin Luther King Jr. also devoted his time to nonviolent resistance and the steps that it takes to get there. A nonviolent campaign consists of ensuring injustice exists, negotiation, self-purification, and then direct action. Each of these steps exists in the Indian independence movement. First, injustice was proven because the British were depriving Indians of free will. As Deming describes, injustice deprives the oppressed of free will, which is violent, and violence is injustice. Then, there was an attempt for negotiation from the British, but this did not work, so they prepared for direct action through marching and protesting. Self-purification took place in order to take direct action. Once Gandhi's followers were prepared for the consequences of nonviolent resistance, they were prepared to take direct action. To this day, nonviolent activists currently attempt to mirror the effects of nonviolent acts. Some do this in modern ways. One example of a modern-day nonviolent technique is hacktivism. Hacktivists are protesters that virtually occupy a space by overloading a website, keeping others from joining that website. This is the same as protesting. They are just occupying a virtual space rather than a physical one, practicing an electronic form of civil disobedience. Domination and oppression took over India for years until they decided to come together and act. Nonviolence eventually pays off in this instance, but it was not simply the act of nonviolence that succeeded. It was the motivation and the mindset of the individuals involved, as well as the values of Satyagraha that was composed by Gandhi. The most effective strategy for the Indian population at this time was the Salt March. The Salt March ties in the methods and theories of Deming, Martin Luther King, and Gandhi, making it a successful collective movement. It is important we study and observe these historical events so we can recreate the events that show desirable outcomes, such as the Indian independence movement.